When I was little, my grandfather would tell me stories about his childhood. Usually they would be stories about adventures he went on with his friends, or how he met Grandma, the usual stuff grandpas tell their grandkids. However, I was growing up in the age of PlayStation and smartphones, and Grandpa and his stories just weren't really interesting to me anymore. I think in his heart this upset Grandpa. I think he really missed spending quality time with his only grandson. My dad picked up on this as well, so he talked with Grandpa, and the two of them scheduled a little road trip to his hometown in Tucson, Arizona. I wasn't exactly thrilled about this. I was 13 years old, and Tucson was a 15-hour drive from where we lived. But Dad insisted that all the technology in the house was driving a wedge between myself and Grandpa, so reluctantly, I agreed to the road trip. The trip itself was about as boring as you'd think. We drove in my grandpa's RV, so I just tried to sleep most of the trip. When we arrived, I expected us to stay in a hotel for the night, but to my disappointment, we pulled into a dusty old RV camp just outside the city limits. It was hot, I had none of my video games, and no reception or Wi-Fi on my phone. I was just praying for this weekend to pass quickly. While I was grumbling about the loss of my technological fixation, Grandpa was standing outside looking off towards the mountains, almost as though he was lost in thought. After a minute, he called to me and asked me to help him set up the campfire. We cooked our dinner over the flames, and I sat looking at the greenish blue sky as the sun sank deeper and deeper behind the mountains.
"Jack," said Grandpa, "do you know why we're staying here?"
"No," I said. "Why?" He set down his bowl and put his thick, calloused hand on my shoulder.
"You can hardly tell now, but this very spot, over 100 years ago, was the very place my grandfather was born and raised."
"Really?" I said, trying my hardest to sound invested.
"Indeed," said my grandpa. "Back in his time, this little patch of land from here to the large rocks all the way out there was known as Nakova, and it was here that he lived his entire life."
At this point, Grandpa could see I was losing interest. I was tired from the trip and had little interest in historical landmarks.
"Did I ever tell you the tale of Reverend Edgar?"
"No, I don't think so, at least." A slight grin came over my grandfather's face.
"Well, it's not a story your folks would want me to tell you."
My interest was slightly piqued at this revelation. We lived in a Lutheran household, so the idea of hearing something scandalous, especially from a man like my grandpa, was very intriguing.
"You wouldn't be interested in hearing it, would you?"
he asked. "Yeah, sure," I said, my excitement barely contained under a cool demeanor, or at least as cool as a 13-year-old could manage.
"You need to promise me something, though,"
said Grandpa, his tone becoming surprisingly serious.
"You need to promise me that this story stays between you and I."
I was even more excited now. "Yeah, I promise."
"Okay, put another log on the fire and I'll tell you."
I put another log into the flames as Grandpa took a sip from his tin coffee cup.
"Now, where to begin? It was 1870. Nakova was a very small town, even in those days. There were a couple of stores, a town hall, a schoolhouse, about 20 homes spread across a few miles, and of course, the largest of the buildings, the old church at the center of the town. Nakova was a religious settlement in its early days, and the families of those early settlers carried on the old ways. Your great-great-grandfather lived and played and went to school on the very ground we are on right now."
"Wow," I said. Though I wasn't entirely blown away by the story so far, it was pretty cool to think that we were on land that my great-great-grandpa walked on over 100 years ago. It was kind of like stepping into the past in a way. Grandpa continued.
"My grandfather and his family lived a quiet and disciplined life. They were also very religious people. The church in town held services twice a day every week, and they attended each one of them."
I grimaced at this. I could barely sit still for a single hour during our Sunday services. I couldn't imagine doing it twice a day.
It was a strict but peaceful life,
said Grandpa.
and the people of Nakova were content to keep to themselves and not bother themselves with the troubles outside their town. That is, unless it affected them directly.
Okay, so why wouldn't Mom and Dad like me hearing this story? I said, starting to feel as though the old man had just said that to get me to listen, which, if that was the idea, I had to commend him.
"You'll see,"
said Grandpa. I was unconvinced, but I kept listening.
"One day," he said, "in the heat of late summer, a strange man made his way to Nakova. He was a very tall man, very thin and lanky, with a tattered black suit, matted gray hair, and deep blue sunken eyes. He carried on his back a brown burlap sack and wore on top of his head a black hat with a wide brim. His name was Reverend Edgar. Now, Reverend Edgar claimed to be, in his own words, a reverend of the true Word of God. No one really knew what he meant by that, but there was something about him that the people of the town found off-putting. Maybe it was the way he was dressed, maybe it was his appearance, or maybe it was the strange way in which he moved about. Regardless, there was also something that many of the townspeople found fascinating about him. An almost hypnotic magnetism, I guess you could call it. And this allure he had over the people would end up causing some problems.
Problems? I said curiously. Strangely enough, the description of this Reverend Edgar alone drew me in. I could almost imagine what the Nakova people saw.
"Yes,"
he said. Grandpa took another sip from his coffee and poked at the fire with a stick.
"You see, the Nakova people, as I said, carried on the religious ways of their forefathers. So when Reverend Edgar came to town, they were more than a little suspicious of him, especially when he began giving sermons in the street. Every day he would stand outside the shops, reading out loud passages from his worn leather Bible, and his messages were anything but comforting. 'My friends, my flock,' he'd say, 'do you not fear the judgment of the Almighty? He has seen the wickedness of his creation, and his judgment is nigh. I am but a humble servant of his righteousness, and I compel thee to follow me. Follow me before it is too late. For I have seen that the Lord's hand moves to smite those who have turned and shunned his word. And I tell you now that you have all shunned the grace of the everlasting Father. Please come with me, follow me, and he will not turn his anger toward thee. You have chance still to regain the salvation which you have forsaken. To me, I say, to me!' Needless to say, many of the townsfolk were not pleased with the words of this so-called reverend. How dare he make such strange and outrageous accusations? Why, they attended church every day. Surely they weren't in danger of losing their salvation." "What happened?" I asked. "Did they just ignore him?" "At first, yes," said Grandpa. "But after a while, his words started causing concern in their hearts. Every day, Reverend Edgar would stand in the street giving his same sermon. 'My children, please, it is not yet too late to turn from your wicked ways and seek the everlasting forgiveness of the Lamb. I am his servant and disciple. Come with me, and I shall guide you towards the throne of the Almighty.' After a few weeks of this, people started meeting with Reverend Edgar. They would ask questions about how he knew the end was coming and how they could be saved. After 3 weeks, over 20 of the townsfolk were standing in the street with him, singing hymns and listening to his sermons. My grandfather, however, was not one among them. His father was very steadfast in his faith, and from the moment that reverend came to town, he knew that this was no man of God. He tried to convince the others, but the words of Reverend Edgar burrowed deep into their minds. They became convinced that God's wrath was imminent and drawing ever closer. and the only man who could save them was the good Reverend.
Doesn't the Bible say we don't know when the end comes, though? I mean, if these people were so religious, wouldn't they know that? Grandpa shook his head and looked at me.
Of course, they knew what the Bible said, but the Bible also warns of the power of the tongue. Reverend Edgar constantly preached that the end was upon them. Before long, the constant exposure to the Reverend's gospel began to take root in their hearts. Their fear of God's wrath overpowered their faith in God's grace. It's just like the old saying goes, if something is repeated often enough, it becomes the truth.
So what happened next? I said.
Well, he said, it got to the point that almost half of the town's population joined Reverend Edgar. And one day, Reverend Edgar stood atop the steps of the church and delivered his new sermon.
My dear brothers and sisters, the time is at hand. The Father's hand moves ever closer to smite us. Yet just as the angel of death passed over the Israelites in Egypt, so too shall his wrath pass over us, his true flock. We will head into the mountains to pray. We will remain there in prayer and reflection until the fury of our God has subsided. From thence, we will spread out into the world, spreading the true message of his holy word. To me, my children, to me! Then what happened? I said. I was wiping sweat from my face. I had been so invested in the story I hadn't realized that I was leaning nearly nose first over the flames. Grandpa was silent for a moment.
Reverend Edgar left that day with 30 of the Nakova townspeople, almost half of the town's population at the time. He led them into the mountains to wait out the wrath of God.
And?
Reverend Edgar and his followers were never seen in Nakova again.
I was silent, trying to think of what could have happened to them.
My grandfather and his family would stay in Nakova the rest of their days. Only my father left to pursue a life out east. Nakova slowly dwindled and was demolished in 1910. This is all that remains.
But I still don't get why this is a story you couldn't tell me. Grandpa looked at me solemnly.
The story isn't over. After leaving Nakova, my father went into the realm of archaeological studies. In 1920, he returned to Arizona on a 3-month excavation project in the mountains. He and his team discovered something while they were digging. About 2 miles into the mountains, they discovered a large round stone about 12 feet around. This stone, according to my father, was not placed there by any natural means. Upon the removal of the stone, a cavern was discovered behind it. What my father saw would haunt him till the day he died. On the floor of the cave, huddled together as though in prayer, were the decayed skeletons of over 30 people, some of which were children. And in the center, a skeleton wearing a black, wide-brimmed hat with a worn leather Bible clutched to its chest.
I'm 27 years old now. My grandfather passed away just last year. Remembering the story of Reverend Edgar, I decided to do some research of my own on the subject. I found only a few scraps of information on Reverend Edgar, and even less on exactly what happened in those mountains. The most likely theory is that they were caught unprepared in the elements and took shelter in a cave and passed away there. But that doesn't explain two things. It doesn't explain how a 2-ton rock was moved in front of the entrance. It also doesn't explain how they all died in the same position. If the story taught me anything, it's to beware of false prophets, and that Reverend Edgar was no man of God.